23:14 hours, November 30th, 1942. Ironbottom Sound, off Tassafaronga Point, Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Raizō Tanaka, 50 years old, stood on the open bridge of the destroyer Naganami, his flagship. The night was clear and black, the sea almost flat, the wind warm and carrying the faint smell of jungle from Guadalcanal, 20-odd kilometers to the south. Ahead of him, 8 destroyers of Destroyer Squadron 2 cut a white wake through the darkness at over 30 knots. Tanaka's mission was not glory. It was rice. Below decks on 6 of his ships, Kuroshio, Oyashio, Kajiro, Suzuki's, Kawakaze, and Makinami, the crews had spent hours manhandling 200 to 240 steel drums apiece onto the sterns and after decks. Each drum held food, ammunition, medical supplies. Each drum was part of a long rope daisy chain, designed to float in the water off Tassafaronga Point. The plan was simple. At the drop point, the destroyers would make a tight turn, cut the lines, and steam away. Swimmers and small boats from shore would grab the rope and haul the drums in. Tanaka knew how desperate the men ashore were. 4 weeks, Japanese troops on Guadalcanal had existed on half and then 1/3 rations. Some frontline units hadn't eaten properly in 6 days. Soldiers were collapsing in the jungle before they even met the enemy. This run was supposed to fix that, at least for a few days. At 23:16, Tanaka lowered his binoculars and glanced at the chart table beside him. The pencil track showed their route from the Shortland Islands, 580 miles to the northwest. They had left in the early hours, slipped through Bougainville Strait, then turned down the slot, New Georgia Sound, toward Guadalcanal, timing their speed to reach Tassafaronga in the darkest hours before midnight. Behind Naganami, the formation was precise. Interval, 600 meters between hulls. Lead destroyer Takanami acted as the forward screen. The 6 supply-laden destroyers followed, and Tanaka's flagship and 1 more escort brought up the rear. From the air, if any Allied recon plane happened to glimpse them in the dusk, they'd look like just another Tokyo Express column. But this night was different. Each destroyer carried its standard outfit of 8 610mm Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, 1 in each tube, no reloads, to save weight for the drums. The Type 93 was a monster, 9 meters long, about 2.7 tons, with a 490-kilogram high-explosive warhead and a range of up to 40 kilometers at around 36 to 38 knots thanks to its oxygen-enriched engine. At shorter ranges, it could run even faster. Against cruisers, 1 hit was often enough to cripple. 2 could break a ship's back. Tanaka had spent much of his career around weapons like this. He'd commanded destroyers, taught at the torpedo school, and earned a reputation as a specialist in night fighting and heavy torpedo attacks. American officers would later call him Tenacious Tanaka. At 23:18, a messenger stepped onto the bridge. Radio from search aircraft, Admiral. Enemy convoy reported near Guadalcanal earlier today. Tanaka already knew. A Japanese scout plane had sighted an Allied force to the south that afternoon. He had signaled his captains to expect contact and to give priority to destroying the enemy over unloading supplies if the 2 missions conflicted. He looked again toward the south. The faint smudge of Savo Island was just becoming visible against the stars. Beyond it lay Ironbottom Sound, named later for the ships that would sink there. Tonight, his 8 destroyers were about to steam directly into that graveyard. The other side of the Sound, 25 minutes earlier, at 22:49, Task Force 67 had entered Lengo Channel on its way toward the same patch of water. On the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Minneapolis, CA-36, Rear Admiral Carlton H. Wright, 57, commander of TF-67, studied his own track. Behind his flag cruiser steamed heavy cruisers New Orleans, Pensacola, Northampton, the light cruiser Honolulu, and then a trail of destroyers, Fletcher, Drayton, Maury, Perkins, Lamson, and Lardner. All told, 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers, built around 8-inch and 6-inch guns, radar sets, and American confidence that they finally held the edge in night fighting. Wright's cruisers carried SG surface search radar, a significant improvement over earlier sets. On paper, his plan was solid. Radar-equipped destroyers, led by Commander William Cole in Fletcher, would run ahead as a vanguard. They would make first contact, fire a surprise torpedo salvo, then clear the line of fire so the cruisers could engage with guns at around 10,000 to 12,000 yards. It was a carefully briefed playbook, night interception by radar, finished by heavy gunfire. But there had been last-minute changes. 2 destroyers, Lamson and Lardner, had joined the task force late, and Wright hadn't had time to brief their skippers. Instead of a clean destroyer screen, his formation had become a slightly tangled procession. 4 vanguard destroyers, 5 cruisers, then 2 trailing destroyers. At 2300 hours, Wright ordered his crews to battle stations. The 5 cruisers each launched a floatplane toward Tulagi to be ready to drop flares over the Japanese formation once contact was made. Below decks, ammunition trains began moving shells. Gun crews checked fuses and elevation drums for the 8-inch/55 and 6-inch/47 guns that would do the killing if the Japanese appeared inside 20,000 yards. The Americans knew something was coming. Allied codebreakers had intercepted a Japanese message about a major supply run that night. Admiral William Halsey had sent Wright forward to intercept and destroy it. For the men in TF-67, this was supposed to be the payback phase of the Guadalcanal campaign. After the brutal naval battle of Guadalcanal earlier in November, they believed the initiative had shifted to the U.S. side. The Guadalcanal problem, the battle brewing in the dark that night, was about more than 2 sets of ships. It was about whether Japan could keep fighting for Guadalcanal at all. Since U.S. Marines had landed on August 7, 1942, seizing the unfinished airfield at Lunga Point, soon renamed Henderson Field, Japan and the United States had fought a grinding, 6-month contest for control of the island. Whoever held Henderson could project air power across the slot and threaten the other supply lines. Japanese commanders had tried to retake the airfield by landing troops in a series of night destroyer runs, the American so-called Tokyo Express. Tanaka had been at the center of those efforts for months, pushing his destroyers to make high-speed night runs from bases at Truk and the Shortlands. But by late November, Allied air power and PT boats had made daylight shipping to Guadalcanal nearly impossible. Attempts using submarines had delivered only 20 to 30 tons of supplies per night, barely enough for a single day's food for the 17th Army. So the Japanese had adopted the drum method. Destroyers would stay offshore, avoiding reefs and shallow water, and offload their cargo without slowing. It was a clever workaround, but it meant the destroyers carried fewer reload torpedoes, fewer shells, and less fuel margin. Any heavy action against a major U.S. surface force would be fought with what they had in their tubes and magazines at that moment. Tanaka knew the risks. He also knew that if he failed to deliver tonight, the hunger and disease ashore would only worsen. Yet his orders from Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa were clear. If forced to choose between the supplies and crippling an enemy force, he was to destroy the enemy. Night after night, Ironbottom Sound had seen ships die for less. Savo Island, Cape Esperance, the earlier Guadalcanal battles, each had already sent cruisers and destroyers to the bottom. Historians would later rank Tassafaronga, along with Savo and Pearl Harbor, among the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. But at 23:20 on November 30th, no one on either bridge knew that yet. First contact at 23:21, the SG radar set in USS Fletcher's darkened plot room picked up a contact. Range, about 27,700 yards, bearing forward of the American column's bow. The blip marched slowly across the oscilloscope, multiple returns in line ahead, moving southeast. Japanese destroyers. Exactly what Halsey had promised them. Cole reported the contact up the chain. The plan said his destroyers should close to torpedo range and fire immediately. But the doctrine was still new, and this was the first time many of these officers had fought with SG radar. Wright hesitated, then ordered more precise target plotting. 4 minutes passed. The Japanese column continued its run, unaware it had already been seen through the night by invisible American electronics. At 23:25, Cole finally received permission to fire. Fletcher, Perkins, and Drayton loosed their Mark 15 torpedoes, long, slim 21-inch weapons with smaller 375-kilogram warheads and far shorter reach than the Japanese Type 93s. The destroyers then turned away to clear the line of fire. But the timing was off. The Japanese formation had already crossed the ideal firing track. All of the American torpedoes would run harmlessly through empty water. On Naganami's bridge, no one yet knew they had been targeted. At 23:26, the faint rumble of gunfire rolled over the water. Tanaka turned his head toward the sound. On the horizon, suddenly, there were pinpricks of orange light, muzzle flashes from heavy guns. The U.S. cruisers, still unaware their own torpedo attack had failed, had opened fire on the lead Japanese destroyer, Takanami, at a range of roughly 11,000 yards. The Americans had finally brought their radar advantage to bear. But with those first bright flashes, they had also given Tanaka everything he needed: range, bearing, and target angles for a torpedo counterattack. He stepped closer to the bridge wing, watching the pattern of lightning along the horizon as his staff shouted bearings and ranges. The cruiser line was there, 5 big hulls in formation, pressing in, each flash a beacon. "Prepare for torpedo attack," Tanaka ordered. "All ships, stand by long lance." The night that would turn a U.S. cruiser line into wreckage was about to begin in earnest. 23:27 hours. The American guns roared again. Salvos from Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, Northampton, and Honolulu arced toward the Japanese van. Shell splashes climbed around Takanami as she zigzagged at high speed, trying to throw off the radar-directed fire. Within moments, several 8-inch shells found her. Flames licked up from her superstructure as explosions tore into the forward decks. From Naganami, Tanaka watched his forward escort stagger under the blows. Takanami had done her job, absorbing the first violence of the American ambush, but she was now crippled and burning. He had only minutes to reverse the situation. "Signal to all ships," he said. "Independent torpedo attack. Use starboard tubes, spread fire. Then retire at full speed." The signalmen flashed the order down the line. On each destroyer, crews rotated their quadruple 610mm mounts, setting gyro angles by hand-cranked dials. White-painted torpedo warheads glinted under canvas covers as sailors made final checks to safety wires and firing levers. 8 tubes per ship, oxygen bottles topped off, warheads live. At 23:28, as the Japanese column slid past the American line on nearly reciprocal courses, Kuroshio fired first, 4 Type 93s, fanning out into the darkness. Oyashio followed with 8, then Kajiro, Kawakaze, and Suzuki's joined in, their launches staggered by seconds. In all, by the end of the minute, 44 long lance torpedoes were running toward the U.S. cruisers. Each torpedo ran silently under the waves at over 45 knots, leaving only a faint, hard-to-see phosphorescent track. Their range gave Tanaka flexibility. Even at 10 to 12,000 yards, they could still close quickly enough to hit hard. The Americans, believing Japanese torpedoes could not reach much beyond 10,000 yards, had no idea they were already inside the lethal envelope of a weapon far beyond their expectations. Minneapolis takes the first blows on USS Minneapolis. Radar tracks looked good. Takanami seemed to be slowing under gunfire. The destroyer vanguard had already turned away. The cruisers held course, maintaining steady fire. At 23:27 and some seconds, just as Minneapolis's gunners sent their 9th salvo toward the burning Japanese destroyer, 2 unseen torpedoes reached her. The first long lance slammed into her port bow, forward of turret 1, detonating under the aviation fuel tanks and magazine spaces. A column of fire and water leapt skyward. The blast folded the bow down at an angle of about 70 degrees, nearly severing it. A second hit near the forward fire rooms killed 3 of 4 boilers and wrecked the electrical systems. The cruiser's forward sections disappeared in a geyser of metal and flame. 37 men died instantly. The shock rolled down the American line. Less than 60 seconds later, a second torpedo streaked in toward USS New Orleans, just astern. It struck almost directly beneath turret 1, detonating the forward magazines and gasoline storage. Everything from the bow back to just ahead of the bridge, over 100 feet of ship, was blown off. The severed bow, its guns still pointing skyward, drifted away into the dark. New Orleans slowed, listing, dead in the water, fires burning forward. From the Japanese perspective, There was only darkness and the distant, intermittent flashes of explosions. On Naganami's bridge, lookouts called out great orange bursts where the U.S. cruisers had been. Tanaka could not see exactly which ships he had hit yet. He didn't need to. The pattern of flashes and radio reports told him enough. The long lances were finding their targets. He gave the next order. All ships, smoke and turn away. Maintain torpedo fire as possible. Do not close for gun duel. Tanaka had no interest in trading shell for shell with heavy cruisers. His doctrine was simple: strike from the dark with torpedoes, then vanish. Pensacola and the burning column at 23:39, the third major hit came. Cruiser USS Pensacola, maneuvering to avoid the stricken Minneapolis and New Orleans, turned left, presenting her broadside to the unseen torpedo tracks. A long lance from Oyashio found her just aft of the mainmast, below the waterline. The explosion ripped open her fuel tanks. Burning oil flooded across the water around her, igniting as it spread. Pensacola listed heavily, her aft turrets jammed, her power systems failing. Flames roared up around her after superstructure. For 12 hours, her crew would fight those fires to keep her from joining Ironbottom Sound's other wrecks. American formation discipline was gone. The cruiser line had become a mess of crippled hulls, each trying to avoid the others in the tight waters west of Savo Island. Honolulu, with better luck and aggressive maneuvering, threaded her way through the chaos, increasing speed and turning sharply to avoid perceived torpedo wakes. She avoided hits, but in the process, created an even more complex maneuvering problem for the cruiser behind her, USS Northampton. Kawakazi's moment at 23:48, Kawakazi finally had the angle she needed. Earlier in the run, she had loosed one spread of torpedoes, but her captain saw an opportunity for a closer shot as the U.S. line bunched up and turned. Now, at less than 10,000 yards, with American cruiser silhouettes backlit by their own fires, Kawakazi fired again. Two long lances ran straight and true toward USS Northampton, which had just steadied on a new course after swerving to avoid the disabled ships ahead. The heavy cruiser had not increased speed as sharply as Honolulu, nor made radical course changes. For a torpedo officer, she was an ideal target. Both torpedoes hit within seconds of each other. One struck 10 feet below the waterline abreast the after engine room. The second exploded roughly 40 feet farther aft. Flooding was immediate and uncontrollable. 3 of the ship's 4 propeller shafts stopped dead. Northampton took on a severe port list and began to slow, burning fiercely aft. 50 men died in the blasts and the fires that followed. By now, Wright's carefully constructed battle plan was in ruins. His destroyer Vanguard was out of position after its unsuccessful torpedo run. His cruiser line had lost 1 ship mortally and 3 severely damaged in less than 20 minutes. And the enemy destroyers that had done the damage were already fading back into the night, some of them still carrying their undelivered drums of food. Disengagement at 23:44, Tanaka issued the final command of the engagement. All ships, break contact. Retire to the northwest at full speed. As the Japanese column pulled away along Guadalcanal's coast, Kuroshio and Kajiro fired another 8 torpedoes in a parting spread. These missed, running through now empty sea or past ships already crippled and struggling. But the battle was effectively over. Behind them, Takanami was still burning fiercely, illuminated by American star shells and gunfire. Tanaka attempted to send Oyashio and Kuroshio back to assist, but by 1 o'clock they found only a wreck engulfed in flames. With American ships still in the area, rescue attempts were abandoned. Of Takanami's crew, fewer than 50 would eventually reach shore alive. In less than an hour of confused, brutal night fighting, 1 Japanese destroyer had been sunk. In exchange, the Japanese torpedo attack had sunk 1 U.S. heavy cruiser, Northampton, crippled 3 others, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, and forced an entire U.S. cruiser-destroyer task force to withdraw. The supply mission had failed. The drums were never dropped. But as a torpedo action, it was a tactical masterpiece, one that would be studied for decades afterward. In the chaos on the American decks, survival now took precedence over victory. Damage control parties went to work, fighting fires and flooding in a desperate race against time. 1:30 hours, December 1, 1942. On USS Northampton, the order finally came, abandon ship. For nearly 2 hours after Kawakaze's torpedoes hit, the crew had fought the flooding. Pumps strained, counter-flooding measures were tried, but the list increased. Fires aft sent pillars of flame into the sky. Ammunition cooked off in small, sporadic bursts. The ship's stern settled lower and lower into the water. At 1:30, with the list at a dangerous angle and no hope of saving the hull, Captain Willard Kitts gave the order. Men went down lines and jumped from the low side into the oil-streaked sea. Nearby destroyers Fletcher and Drayton moved in to pick up survivors, maneuvering carefully around floating debris. At 3:04, Northampton rolled and slid under, about 4 nautical miles from Doma Cove on Guadalcanal. She would give her name to another of Ironbottom Sound's many wreck sites. Fletcher and Drayton ultimately rescued 773 survivors from the water. Many were burned, concussed, or suffering from shrapnel wounds. Some clung to pieces of wreckage for hours in the dark before a searchlight or shouted call reached them. Limping to Tulagi, the 3 surviving damaged cruisers, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Pensacola, now faced a different battle, the struggle not to sink before they could reach safety. At dawn, they were only about 19 nautical miles from Tulagi, a small harbor on the far side of Ironbottom Sound. To get there, they would have to move slowly, half-crippled, through waters where Japanese submarines were known to prowl. Minneapolis, bow folded down and nearly severed, could still make bare steerageway. Temporary shoring kept the twisted steel from breaking off entirely. New Orleans, missing her entire forecastle, plowed forward with a makeshift bow of jagged metal just ahead of the bridge. Seawater poured over her exposed decks. Pensacola, her stern and after superstructure burning, made slow speed under the constant effort of damage control parties. On board, the work was brutal and simple. Fire teams advanced inch by inch into smoke-filled compartments, dragging hoses and wearing improvised respirators. Repair parties braced bulkheads with timber and steel, fighting to keep ruptured seams from tearing wider under the ship's own movement. Medical teams set up triage stations in mess decks and passageways, treating burns and blast injuries by lantern light. It took 12 hours to fully extinguish Pensacola's fires. Only after that could her crew be sure she would live to see a repair yard. By the morning of December 1st, all 3 damaged cruisers had reached Tulagi. Covered in foliage camouflage and moored close to shore, they presented a ghostly sight, huge wounded hulls tucked under the jungle, their scars hastily hidden from enemy reconnaissance. Temporary repairs, including rough coconut log bows for Minneapolis and New Orleans, would eventually allow them to steam to major yards for full reconstruction. Japanese losses and frustration for Tanaka, the morning brought mixed feelings. His force had scored a major tactical victory. 8 destroyers, using torpedoes alone, had smashed a larger enemy cruiser force and escaped without further loss beyond the already doomed Takanami. But the supply mission had failed. None of the vital drums were in the water off Tassafaronga. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal remained hungry and undersupplied. Shortly afterward, Tanaka would lead another major attempt on December 11th to run supplies with 11 destroyers. That night, USPT boats intercepted the column off Guadalcanal. Tanaka's flagship on that run, Terazuki, took torpedo hits and was ultimately scuttled, with Tanaka himself wounded. The effort delivered only a fraction of the intended supplies ashore. At higher levels, the Japanese Navy was beginning to accept a bitter reality. Even brilliant night actions could not overcome the logistics crisis. On December 12th, senior naval leaders formally proposed abandoning Guadalcanal. Despite resistance from the Army, Imperial General Headquarters approved an evacuation at the end of the month. Between the 2nd and the 7th of February 1943, under Operation Coup, the remaining Japanese troops slipped away, conceding the island. Tassafaronga had been both a triumph of tactics and a symptom of strategic failure. Human cost, the casualty lists on both sides told their own story. The U.S. Navy lost 395 to 417 men killed, most of them on Northampton, Minneapolis, and New Orleans. Another several hundred were wounded. Japanese losses were smaller in absolute terms, around 200 killed, primarily from Takanami's crew, but they were irreplaceable veterans of the destroyer force. On New Orleans, the blast that tore off her bow also killed 3 brothers from the same family, the Rogers brothers, echoing the loss of the 5 Sullivan brothers only weeks earlier aboard the light cruiser USS Juno. These tragedies would help shape U.S. policies against siblings serving together in combat zones. For survivors, the night left deep marks. Men remembered the sensation of decks buckling under their feet, of being thrown across compartments by shock waves, of scrambling through smoke-choked passageways lit only by emergency lanterns and the red glow of fires. On the Japanese side, Takanami's survivors abandoned their burning ship around 1:30. Many died in a massive secondary explosion in the water, likely from detonating magazines or torpedoes. The few dozen who reached Guadalcanal did so swimming or clinging to wreckage. About 20 of them would be captured by American patrols. By sunrise on December 1st, Ironbottom Sound had claimed another heavy cruiser and a destroyer. The seabed off Savo Island grew more crowded. And yet, in Tokyo, Tassafaronga did not bring Tanaka promotion or broad praise. The failure to deliver supplies, combined with his skepticism about continued operations on Guadalcanal, made him unpopular with some superiors. Within weeks, his combat sea commands would be taken away. In the months after Tassafaronga, the war moved on, but the lessons of that night stayed with the officers who survived it. Rear Admiral Raizō Tanaka did not command destroyers at sea again after late 1942. Wounded in December and out of favor with the High Command, he was reassigned first to Singapore and then to shore duty in Burma, where he remained for the rest of the war. He was promoted to Vice Admiral in 1944, but his days leading torpedo squadrons in night actions were over. On June 26, 1946, Tanaka retired from the Navy. In post-war Japan, he quietly supported naval veterans associations and the emerging Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, sharing his experience with a new generation of officers. He died in 1969 at the age of 77, remembered by his peers as a master of destroyer tactics and by his former enemies as Tenacious Tanaka, the man who had repeatedly slipped through their defenses in the Solomons. Doctrinal shock for the U.S. Navy. For the U.S. Navy, the shock of Tassafaronga went beyond the loss of ships. It forced a hard re-examination of assumptions about night fighting and torpedoes. Investigations after the battle concluded that U.S. destroyers had failed to exploit their radar advantage, delaying their torpedo attack and then withdrawing too early. The cruisers had held steady courses for too long, at predictable speeds, making them ideal targets for long-range torpedo spreads. There had been serious underestimation of Japanese torpedo capability, both in range and destructive power. Captured examples of the Type 93 in 1943 finally revealed the full extent of the threat, a 610 mm weapon with nearly double the range of standard Allied torpedoes and a warhead that could break a heavy cruiser in half. U.S. analysts recognized that many earlier mystery sinkings, previously blamed on submarines or mines, had probably been caused by long-range surface-launched long lances. Over time, the U.S. Navy responded with changes in doctrine and training. Night battle drills began to emphasize frequent course and speed changes when Japanese destroyers were known to be nearby. Destroyer skippers were trained to be more aggressive in using radar-directed torpedo attacks, rather than holding back for perfect information. Greater attention was paid to coordinating radar plots with visual lookout reports, to avoid the kind of delayed engagement that had doomed TF-67. The cruisers themselves returned to action. Minneapolis, New Orleans, and Pensacola, after months in repair yards, rejoined the fleet with reconstructed bows and improved damage control features. Their scars, often photographed and studied, became physical case studies in what a single long lance hit could do to a modern warship. Strategic meaning in purely tactical terms, Tassafaronga was one of Japan's finest surface victories of the Pacific War, a classic destroyer ambush in which a smaller force inflicted disproportionate damage on a larger opponent. But strategically, it changed little. Less than 3 months later, Japan would evacuate Guadalcanal and shift to a defensive posture in the Central Solomons. American industrial power and carrier aviation were already reshaping the balance of the Pacific. No number of brilliantly executed torpedo attacks could offset the loss of carriers, trained pilots, and fuel. Yet the battle mattered in another way. It showed what skilled commanders could do with light forces and superior weapons, even when the broader war was turning against them. Tanaka's ability to improvise under fire, to recognize when the supplies had to be sacrificed to destroy the enemy, and to use his destroyer's strengths, speed, agility, and torpedoes, became a model for later discussions of asymmetric naval warfare. Memory and legacy today, divers visit the wrecks on the floor of Ironbottom Sound, Northampton, Takanami, and the other ships that did not make it home. Museums display sections of long-lance torpedoes and photographs of cruisers with their bows blown off, teaching new generations about the night in 1942 when 8 Japanese destroyers tore through a U.S. cruiser line. In naval colleges and on YouTube channels that dissect forgotten battles, the Battle of Tassafaronga remains a case study in how technology, radar, can be squandered by hesitant doctrine. How a single category of weapon, the Type 93, can dominate a night engagement. How a commander like Tanaka could win tactically while losing strategically, trapped in a larger war his side could no longer sustain. For Tanaka himself, the legacy is complicated. He was a professional officer serving an imperial system that ultimately led Japan into catastrophe. But within that context, his skill at managing destroyer squadrons, his understanding of logistics, and his willingness to speak frankly about the futility of continued operations on Guadalcanal mark him as more than just a gifted tactician. On the night of November 30th, 1942, his 8 destroyers failed to feed the starving soldiers of Guadalcanal. Instead, they fed Ironbottom Sound with steel and wreckage, turning a proud U.S. cruiser line into burning hulks in less than half an hour. That imbalance, between tactical brilliance and strategic dead end, is why the story of Tassafaronga still resonates. It is a reminder that individual courage and skill can shape a battle, but not always the war.